I just very confidently hit the record button today and I'm doing the thing. Hello, welcome to Trying Times, the show where we talk about trying times. That's the purpose for the title. But I guess if I were to fully define what trying times means by dictionary, it would more so state times of trouble or struggle or unhappiness. And that's not entirely what we're talking about on this show or like what I want this show to be. The trying times I'm kind of focusing on are more so those that include and are not limited to just some phases we may go through in life. And, some of those obviously being a little difficult, but for the most part, those that are kind of cringy and funny to look back on now. So I don't know about you. I'm assuming it's the same, or if not more or less. I've had my fair amount of trying times, and a lot of those have been painfully cringy. But guess what? I've lived through it, and now I'm here to recall a bunch of those times with you in a way that feels kind of like a conversation with a good friend, maybe that I haven't seen in a while. So, yeah, I guess think of this as a big catch up session. But of course, every episode is about something totally different from the last or next one. So, yeah, I mean, just like a regular conversation, really, is what I'm defining here, is a regular conversation. Oh, and by the way, I'm Carmen, and I'm a creative in my mid-20s working in the world of media, just trying to figure out life, such as anyone else, pretty much, in case you're new here, or whether you've listened to other episodes before. That was my tacky elevator pitch that I do at the beginning of each episode. And normally I kind of announce that. So today I thought, rather than announcing it, it might feel a little bit more organic to just do the thing. So that's what I did. But alas, it was still very awkward for me. So that's out of the way now. I don't have to think about that anymore. This episode is going to be a little bit more about something kind of like I mentioned in the beginning. It could be perceived as quite upsetting for some, or it could be, just like a very interesting subject for others that maybe you haven't thought about before. But today's episode is going to be a little bit more about homesickness. So I don't know, like I said before, it's not at some points going to feel the most upbeat, at least not how I want to kind of dissect it. I just want to do that in a very honest way that relates to me, and maybe it'll relate to you or someone else that you know. I'm not sure, but I do hope in doing that it is insightful or relatable or kind of like eye-opening maybe for someone. To get into that, I think it's important to say that there are multiple forms of homesick. I already messed it up. To kind of get into that, I think it's really important to note that there are multiple forms of homesickness. Like, as we know, that sort of translates to this longing and sometimes even distress we could feel for home, whether that's when we make a temporary or permanent move or change in our lives. So, there's that moment when you sort of have to relocate and such, and that is usually the initial stage. So, typically, right when you are in the settling stage of a new space, or even possibly in the very early stage of still, packing before you've even left, this occurs at very different times for people. So, like, that's kind of just one of the phases that occurs. And by the way, like, none of the stuff I'm saying right now is going to be like the exact same for everyone across the board. And it's not like I'm drawing out like a grid of like phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four, phase five. It's not like that. I'm kind of going through it the way that I've read about it a little bit, and also in ways that I have felt that I could relate to those phases that I read about. So that would kind of be the first one. But then let's say once that's recognized, that kind of like initial nervousness or maybe a little bit of shock, you might find yourself with that stress or longing for home. And like it could happen, like I said, at different points for anyone. And that is it's like the onset of homesickness. And it could look and feel a variety of ways for anyone, like I said. For someone, it might be this process of kind of double thinking why they are leaving and potentially refusing to make the move because it feels so uncomfortable. And for others, it may be a little while into their relocation or this change in their life where they're already well into their settling stage, and like they feel kind of like they've made that new home a good space for them. But then it's like this feeling of loneliness or emptiness kind of creeps up where they realize maybe they are not with all the things that they were used to growing up with. So, like those, kind of external comforters, or not comforters, but those kind of external variables aren't necessarily there that they've become accustomed to. So, this kind of then leads into whatever sort of separation anxiety or difficulties you might be facing. Those kind of all link together in a way. So, for instance, that can relate to something such as our sensory functions. Like, smell is a really, really big one. If you, like most people, become accustomed to a space, something, even like a new space, and a lack of that smell or whatever it could be, could really throw you off. So, like, let's say you got used to growing up in the same home. Every space and thing and person, whatever, everything kind of has its own smell. And it becomes kind of like this, like, nostalgic thing for a lot of people. For me, a lot of the time, I find that that's a big thing. And so being out of that and not really actively, obviously, realizing that, like most people wouldn't, it could be really confusing and it could really throw you off. It could also just kind of remind you a little bit more, I guess, repetitively of the distance you may be feeling from friends or family or whoever, because you're not really as close to that, or at least that isn't as accessible as it once was. So then from there, kind of in its final stages, or peak, I guess, because this would be kind of like the worst of it, at least how I've seen it, this could almost, I guess, gather into like this ball of like stress or nervousness, and in a way manifest itself into a sort of depression or anxiety, or even almost like a claustrophobia. Like you just feel really uneasy and almost like you're just being forced into a new space. And like that feeling does, in a lot of ways, at least how I've read it and kind of have felt it, does relate a lot to claustrophobia. It's just really unsettling. So, regardless of where home is for you, this can occur at any point, really. Like over time, as it all builds up, it could also begin to potentially affect your social life, or I guess your will to socialize in a way. So, let's say if you meet someone new, whether at work, as a friend, or romantically, whatever it may be, they may not be meeting you at your most authentic point as you're struggling with coping with the stage of homesickness, which, like I said, varies for everybody. So for some, this could take a few weeks to get past, and it might not get to the point of actually dictating your social skills or kind of ridiculing your mental health. It maybe just comes and goes and it copes very easily. Whereas for others, it may take an upward of even closer to a year. And that's okay if it does. Like whatever it is, that's okay. It's just, you got to make sure as it's happening that you're doing things to kind of break that cycle a little bit, or break it up at least a little bit, so that there are little waves of progression in there. So in sum, that's like a fairly general breakdown of homesickness, and I guess the phases that come within that. And like I said, it's all something that I've dealt with and have found to be quite a struggle. It's also something that a lot of people I know and love have dealt with, and it's been quite a struggle for them as well. So I feel like it's kind of this topic that's sometimes a little overlooked, and you don't think too much about it like until it's happening to you or someone that you know is struggling with that. And then it's all very new and kind of fresh, and you don't really know how to dissect that. And so I kind of wanted this to be like that conversation on that and how to kind of break it up. And like I said, share a little bit more about how it was for me. So what I want to focus on a bit more today is obviously all of that, but also not just necessarily in the conventional sense of missing home, specifically where you may have grown up and lived for a while, but instead this idea of working from the inside out. And just stick with me. I know like that probably sounds a little bit bizarre, but I'm referring a little bit more to this idea of feeling comfortable in yourself and in your mind and in your body, however that may look for you, and thus further moving into that comfort and kind of opening that up in your own space. And not necessarily just keeping that comfort in one zone, but growing that from inside out, if that kind of makes sense. I feel like I'm not describing it the way that I'm thinking it, but pretty much how to move that comfort into your own space and not just necessarily go into comfort when you're in one space particularly. A lot of this connects to self-awareness, I think. At least for me, it does. And when I say like finding this comfort and moving it into your space and working from inside out, it doesn't have to be this very strong and pristine sort of level of self awareness by any means. There are many who strive to achieve that in hopes that it'll make it easier. And honestly, take it from someone who is a little overly self aware, it's just as tough. And if anything, you tend to guess more so why you may be feeling a certain way in a certain moment, and that actually is usually pretty spot on in some way, shape, or form, which solves like this temporary component of homesickness. But then it also trickles into this thing of like, let me think about this other thing, or why this may not feel right, or why something feels wrong. So, although it's like this huge pro to have that, it's also a massive con, because that in itself can also really push someone into like a rabbit hole of nonstop analyzing, assessing, or ruminating on the same thing over and over and over again, which already is something that I think a lot of people struggle with when they're facing homesickness. So that can sometimes make it actually a little bit harder. So I think to share a little bit more on how I've coped, or lack thereof at times, I could share my own experiences in a way that I guess reflects that homesickness breakdown I did earlier, and how to cope through it from an inward stance. So like I said, I know that sounds weird and I don't know why, but I'm just going to try it out and kind of see how this goes. And so in the past now, I think I've moved about 5 or 6 times, and each of the times that I've moved was for one reason or another. So it was to relocate and live either with a friend or on my own during like very different times of my life. So a big chunk of those moves, like I said, was for school, and a couple were for work. So with that being said, these moves were anywhere from a few months long to a year at a time. And they were all within Canada, so it wasn't like the worst. One of them was in a different province, so that was like my first time kind of really being far away from home, and it was on the other side of Canada. So that was kind of an interesting change and something that I'd never gotten to do before. Thankfully, through each of these times that I'd moved, I was able to visit home and family and friends at some point or many points. And that made it a lot easier, but also in some ways made it a little bit harder. Like it made the homesickness linger, I think, because it was like this moment I wanted to hold on to. Like I finally get to see people that I feel comfortable around, people that have known me forever, and like those that care and really love, opposed to, obviously when you're in a new space, you have to meet new people, and that can always be daunting. Like that's a whole other thing, right? So naturally, the first stage I think I mentioned was recognizing a feeling of stress or that longing for home, and in a lot of ways comfort and safety. So sticking to what I knew and do know, for me this was always pretty early. I'm talking like always as I'm packing and just feeling like maybe I don't need to go, but also recognizing that greater things could come from trying something new and in a new place. And that would always feel really, really hard to fight against. So something I did was research where I was going for no matter how long it was going to be for. And then I would kind of like look at places that looked like cool things I wanted to do there, or cool places I wanted to visit, and whatever else, that kind of stuff. So for instance, something obviously that I like to do, I think a lot of people like to do, is just explore new cafes. So I would kind of look for those wherever I was going, and then write down a list of those and some places to sightsee and so forth. And, regardless of how much of the list that I did go through or I may not have gone through, whatever I did get to do, it was always great. And that list before being able to be there and go there and do something different always gave me this level of excitement for something just to look forward to, and that I found to be very helpful. So I guess from here, the next step, post recognizing that feeling, could feel like a loneliness. This could occur, like I said, very quick into your time in a new space, or maybe while you're shifting, whatever it might be. So, anytime I was moving or adjusting into a new place, I would bring something with me from either my room at home or from home that felt like a comfort and just put that in my space. That could be a blanket, a candle, a pillow, just something small, but something that could ensure comfort for you. So, that was what that was for me. And it always helped. I'm also a big fan of candles. So, for some people, maybe buying a specific scent would remind them of home or of a person, and that's very common. I'm generally, like I said, a lover of candles. So, for me, having candles around just made any space I was in feel a lot more like home and just a lot warmer and more comfortable for me. So, more than just material, a big thing, I think, like aside from the candles, that I would do at this stage was write. I've talked about it before in previous episodes, but I love journaling. I have probably a little bit too many journals all the time on me, just like ready to go. And if I'm out and I don't have a journal, then I have my phone, and my phone has this wonderful thing in it called the Notes app. And I have way too many notes in there. That was a huge thing I would do. Writing out whatever I was feeling, and also specifically with no judgment towards myself, is a huge help. So I don't know if you've tried that before, but typically when we write, I think we kind of like see what we're writing, and we're like, at least for me, it's kind of this thing of like, oh my God, like, I don't know, oddly, not secondhand embarrassment, but you're assessing everything you're writing, and you're just like, oh, why am I thinking that? Why am I feeling that? Whatever it may be. So try to write like a page or half a page or even a few sentences to start, maybe. And try writing out something that maybe you're stressed about or worried about. Write it down with absolutely zero judgment towards it. Like, write it down as if it's something that your friend wrote and is sharing with you. You know, you'd want to support them, or so I'd hope. You'd want to support them in that process. And so you kind of got to do the same for yourself, right? And you can't judge yourself for that. So that I found to be a huge lifesaver, quite literally. And it also helped to relieve a lot, like I said earlier, of those ruminating thoughts or stresses that you might have just kind of going through your brain over and over. It's like a little like brain dump you can do, and it helped so much. So the next step, like I mentioned way earlier, is that separation anxiety or potential lingering difficulties that could appear in spurts. Even if you feel like you're making progress in some ways, these little like reappearing things or feelings or thoughts are like the thing that drag you down and make you feel even worse. And it is so frustrating. So a big thing I remembered often was that comfort felt at home, and to further create a comfort for myself. So maybe unlocking ways that you felt comfort at home. I think for myself and for a lot of people, that was mainly like a routine of some sort. Naturally, obviously, that might not include all the same people that a routine at home could include, but thankfully, I had access to things like FaceTime and calling and just the internet, whatever, all these things that I think we often take for granted now to contact loved ones from home and people that I wanted to talk to every day. So if it was school or work, I always had my own morning routine and evening routine. This helped to start my day with a little bit less anxiety and ended in a way that I could wind down to feel a little more at ease at the end of the day, regardless of how the day went. So I would usually wake up in the morning, of course, naturally. Or maybe for you, I don't know, you could start work in the evening, I don't know. I would wake up, do a meditation, get ready for the day, and then sit down to have breakfast. And then upon returning home, I would usually shower immediately, have dinner, and then unplug from my phone for at least like half an hour, maybe an hour, and just either watch something, listen to something, or read. And it was just like a nice way to carve out a little bit of time and like what felt like something a little bit more what I wanted to do for me every single day. Granted, it didn't always work every day. Like sometimes if I had a really long day, sometimes I would just be tired and I would come home and I would just let myself rest. Or I would just come home and I would let myself just like be on my phone and talking to like family or friends, whoever it was. But like I think starting with like a base, kind of like a foundation for that, is really important, and it is very beneficial. It's also just I think really important for obviously like your own development and overall productivity, but it does boost your brain a little. And each morning and each evening, you'll have this thing to look forward to. It could change to include anything you enjoy in it, like daily, weekly, whatever it is. So for me, like it was exciting, but it just also made me feel a little bit more organized and not so scatterbrained on the outside, even if I wasn't feeling my best on the inside. Later on, it kind of like helped to work as a method that impacted me a little bit more positively. And this did eventually help my mood and attitude bit by bit as well. So, on a day to day basis, this was kind of something that made the day go by better in a way where, it started the way I wanted and it ended the way I wanted. So, that was really important for me. And of course, speaking of mood, the final stage, like I said earlier, could be severe anxiety or even depression. And in all honesty, I've struggled before with both of these and both in relation to homesickness. It can feel crippling at times. It makes you feel just very out of place, and there's this heavy lack of interest in socializing. And then when you do socialize, you find yourself feeling extremely exhausted. And it's just really disorienting and can leave you feeling almost disorganized mentally, emotionally, physically, like in all ways. So, something that kind of helped me cope with that a little bit was that I got more into exercising and working out when I could. And this is something that I've done to kind of help with my anxiety probably since I was about 16 years old, maybe a little bit before or after that. So, oh my God, 16 was longer ago than I remember, or at least that I'm choosing to remember. But yeah, so I got into that, and it was just really beneficial. And in addition to that, I was journaling a bunch, like constantly. It helped me daily, sometimes even multiple times a day to journal. And like I said before, do this like brain dump onto paper or digitally so I wasn't ruminating too much on one thing. And obviously, doing this doesn't fully, like 1,000% eliminate worry, but it does help aid in it. And both of these things together were kind of giving my anxiety and anything else like a run for their money because I was burning a lot of negative energy when I would exercise, and then I was also eliminating a lot of unnecessary ruminations from my mind with writing. So collectively, that was very, very helpful. And I would 100% recommend that to anyone that may be feeling that way. And it doesn't have to be in regards to homesickness. If you just find yourself feeling very anxious and stressed, like you're living at home and you're in a space where you're like, well, I've been comfortable here my whole life, I think trying both of those could be helpful. And it might make a difference for you over time. That could just be like a positive little hobby you might find yourself enjoying later on. I know exercising, everyone's like, that's not a hobby. I think it's fun when I think about how I feel afterwards. Maybe not so much in the moment, unless you're like mad, then it helps, but I don't know. Like, I'll be honest, it took me a while to bounce out of that depression and everything. It's really important to note that it hits very heavy when it happens, and I was very aware of it when it happened, but that doesn't mean that I 1000% knew how to pull myself out of it. Like I said, that self-awareness thing is very helpful, but it's also like a double-edged sword because you're aware of it happening, but you can't really do anything to stop it from happening. You just kind of have to let it go. And unfortunately, in this instance for me, it became very severe and I couldn't do much about it aside from small things daily. And like I said, it didn't solve the issue entirely, but it did help to reinforce a little more positivity in my life. So I just did that. I just kept doing little things that were beneficial, and that's natural. Like, it isn't something that just disappears in a moment, but I think it's really important to say that for myself, at least, I realized I can work with it opposed to against it to feel a little better again. And so that's what I did. So, as heavy as a subject may be, you don't have to answer this to like anyone if you don't want to, or you could just answer in your head if you want, if you're listening to this maybe while you're out and about. Have you ever struggled this heavily with homesickness in a way that maybe you never thought about before, but now you're kind of like thinking back on it and you're like, wait, I found myself there before? And if so, is it something that affected you daily or did it come and go in waves? Like I said, you didn't have to answer this for anyone. You don't have to tell me per se, but if it's something that you want to answer on your own, definitely go for it. And I'm not sure if anyone listening can fully relate to the way I may have felt it, or maybe you can. But either way, if this is something you've faced or are facing, you will make it through. You got this. I know it. I'm telling you. You're very brave, okay? So hopefully some of the tips that I found helpful and have shared throughout this can be helpful to someone else. And overall, I just want to say again, thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate it a lot. And if you found this episode relatable or insightful or anything, or want to share it with someone, please do. And if you want to chat at all about this or have anything like interesting to add, if you have your own tips, whatever it may be, feel free to comment if that's available on your listening platform that you're listening to this on right now. I'm like stuttering. I've been talking for so long. If you want to comment and that's available for you, go ahead. Or if you want to chat, you can head over to Instagram. My username is at I'm Carmen Kang. So IMCarmenKang. So yeah, feel free to chat away. There is also an Instagram for this podcast. It's at the Trying Times Podcast on Instagram. So go check that out. Feel free to DM on either of those accounts if you have anything you want to share. And I'd love to chat. So yeah, I hope to hear from you and we'll talk soon, okay? Bye.